The jungle was already awake when the helicopters came. The sky over the A Shau Valley trembled with the thump of rotor blades, shaking the mist from the trees below. The air was hot and heavy, smelling of rain, smoke, and the green rot of the monsoon season. Down there, somewhere beneath the clouds, waited a hill that no one had ever cared about until this morning. A steep rise of mud and jungle that the maps called Hill 937. To the men flying toward it, it was just another piece of ground. Another target. Another mission in a war that never seemed to end. Inside the lead helicopter sat the men of the 101st Airborne Division, their faces streaked with sweat and camouflage paint. They were quiet, staring at the jungle below, holding their rifles tight between their knees. None of them knew yet that they were about to climb into one of the bloodiest fights of the entire war, a fight that would turn that nameless hill into a legend. But before we move deeper into the strange events ahead, take a moment to stay connected. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tap like if this one pulled you in. The hype button beside subscribe and share helps these stories reach more curious minds. And if you're listening from somewhere far away tonight, drop a comment below. I'd love to know where this journey finds you. The valley below them was a nightmare made real. For years, the A Shau had been one of the most dangerous places in Vietnam. A deep cut of jungle stretching along the Laotian border, filled with hidden trails, underground bunkers, and North Vietnamese troops who knew every inch of the terrain. This was their fortress, and the Americans were flying straight into its heart. The mission had a name, Operation Apache Snow. The goal was simple on paper: move into the valley, find the enemy, and destroy their base. Hill 937 was just one part of that plan, but the hill, thick with bamboo, elephant grass, and triple canopy trees, would soon turn that simple order into a nightmare. As the helicopters dropped toward the landing zone, the silence broke. Machine gun fire erupted from the tree line, the air filled with tracers, glowing red lines slicing through the mist. The men inside the choppers ducked low as rounds punched through the fuselage, snapping through metal and flesh. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted for the door gunners to fire. The door-mounted M60S opened up, roaring over the chaos, cutting holes through the jungle below. The first wave of helicopters touched down hard in a small clearing. Soldiers jumped into waist-high grass, sinking into the mud as bullets snapped overhead. The air was thick with smoke and dirt. The ground shook with explosions. A mortar round hit near the edge of the clearing, throwing a wall of mud and shrapnel into the air. Within minutes, the landing zone was chaos. Men were yelling, firing, crawling for cover. The sound of gunfire rolled down from the hill above, echoing through the valley like thunder. Every direction looked the same: green, thick, and deadly. The North Vietnamese were dug in deep. Their bunkers were hidden behind walls of vines and branches, invisible until they opened fire. They had built tunnels into the hill, thick log-roofed firing pits that could survive bombs and artillery. Every time the Americans thought they had silenced one, another opened up somewhere else. The fight lasted for hours. The jungle burned in patches where rockets and grenades had hit, filling the air with black smoke and the bitter stench of burning leaves. Rain began to fall, not hard, just enough to turn the ground into soup. The soldiers slipped and fell as they tried to climb higher, their boots sinking deep into the mud. By late afternoon, the first attack had failed. Too many were dead or wounded to keep pushing. Helicopters circled overhead, trying to evacuate the injured, but enemy fire tore through the air. One helicopter was hit and spiraled into the trees, disappearing in a burst of fire. The men who were left dug in near the bottom of the slope, building shallow fighting holes as the rain came harder. The jungle hissed as it burned. Somewhere above them, the North Vietnamese soldiers were still shouting, still firing, still invisible. When darkness fell, the firing finally stopped. The jungle went silent except for the sound of rain dripping through the broken canopy. The soldiers sat in the mud, their uniforms soaked, their nerves shot. Medics moved between them quietly, checking pulses, patching wounds, covering the dead with ponchos. In a command tent a mile away, Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, the man in charge, stood over a muddy map lit by a single lamp. He was known for being relentless, even ruthless, and he was certain the hill could be taken. Too much had been lost already to stop now. Tomorrow, he told his officers, they would attack again. Out in the valley, the rain kept falling. The fires still burned faintly through the mist, and somewhere above the clouds, the hill waited, silent, dark, and hungry. In a few days, it would earn a name the world would never forget. They would call it Hamburger Hill. The next morning began the same way, with noise. The deep, rhythmic pounding of helicopter rotors rolled through the mist like a heartbeat. Rain fell in a thin curtain, turning the world into shades of green and grey. The hill loomed ahead, shrouded in fog, its slopes crawling with unseen life and death. The men of the 101st Airborne Division were moving again. Their boots sank into the mud with every step. Their uniforms were soaked through before they even reached the base of the hill. Each man carried more than 70 pounds of gear: rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, water, and the unspoken weight of what they already knew. This was not going to be quick. The jungle swallowed them whole. The trees were so thick that light barely touched the ground. The air was wet and heavy, every breath tasting of dirt and decay. The soldiers moved in single file, hacking through vines, slipping on roots, checking every step for tripwires. The only sounds were the hum of insects and the distant rumble of artillery echoing through the valley. Then the jungle exploded. Machine gun fire ripped through the silence, cutting down branches and men alike. The air filled with the whip of bullets, the smell of smoke, and the screams of the wounded. The North Vietnamese were waiting, hidden in bunkers dug into the hillside, their firing ports masked by leaves. The hill itself seemed to be shooting back. The soldiers hit the ground, pressing their faces into the mud as the air came alive with gunfire. Mortar rounds slammed into the earth, showering dirt and leaves over everything. A radio operator was hit in the chest. A squad leader vanished in the blast of a grenade. Medics crawled through the mud, dragging bodies into what little cover there was. The order came over the radio. Keep moving. They pushed forward, crawling through the undergrowth, firing at muzzle flashes, throwing grenades into holes they couldn't even see. Every few steps, someone went down. The jungle felt alive, but it wasn't life. It was a predator, swallowing everything that moved. By midday, the rain came harder. The men were soaked, filthy, and running low on ammunition. Helicopters tried to resupply them, but the valley was too hot with fire. Pilots circled above, waiting for an opening that never came. Down below, the soldiers fought on, their weapons jamming with mud and water. The North Vietnamese were relentless. They knew the terrain, they knew the angles, and they had built a fortress out of the hill itself. Every time the Americans destroyed a bunker, another opened behind it. The ground was riddled with tunnels and trenches, allowing the defenders to vanish and reappear like ghosts. Late in the afternoon, air support arrived. F-4 Phantoms streaked overhead, their engines howling as they released bombs and napalm across the slope. The explosion shook the ground like earthquakes. The jungle erupted into flame, sending black smoke towering into the clouds. The heat rolled down the hill like a wave. The soldiers on the ground felt it on their faces, in their lungs. They could smell the burning, wood, grass, flesh. When the fire died down, they moved again. The hill was worse now. The ground was slick with ash. The air burned with every breath. Trees had turned to twisted black skeletons, and the mud steamed from the heat of the bombs. The men moved like shadows through the smoke, stepping over the bodies of friends and enemies alike. But the enemy wasn't gone. As the soldiers reached the next ridge, gunfire erupted again, close this time, almost point blank. The North Vietnamese had survived underground. They rose from the dirt like spirits, firing until the barrels of their rifles glowed red. The Americans fired back, shouting through the smoke. Grenades exploded at their feet. Dirt and debris rained down. One man dropped his weapon to pull a wounded comrade behind a fallen tree. Another crawled forward to throw a grenade into a bunker and disappeared in the blast. By the time the sun began to set, the hill was burning again. Flames licked up the slopes, lighting the rain as it fell. The soldiers pulled back to the base of the hill, dragging the wounded with them, their eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. Night came quickly in the jungle. The firelight flickered against their helmets as they dug in. Flares drifted overhead, bathing the battlefield in pale light. The rain never stopped. The valley was filled with the smell of smoke and blood. The cries of the wounded echoed through the darkness. Somewhere above, the enemy was still there, silent, unseen, waiting for the next attack. The men sat in the mud, cleaning their weapons, staring into the fire, and wondering how a single hill could cost so much. They didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The fight for Hill 937 would last for days more, and before it was over, the mountain itself would become a legend, one that would scar every man who climbed it. In the morning, they would go up again, and the jungle would be waiting. By the third morning, the hill had already earned a new name among the men, Hamburger Hill. Nobody remembered who said it first. Maybe it was a grunt in a foxhole. Maybe a helicopter pilot watching from above. It didn't matter. The name fit. The hill chewed you up and spat you out. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It poured down in grey sheets, blurring the ridgeline into a smear of shadow and smoke. The slopes were nothing but slick mud, broken trees, and shell craters filled with brown water. Every inch of that mountain had been hit by artillery, rockets, and napalm. And still, the enemy was there. The men of the 101st Airborne were starting to believe the hill was cursed. They climbed it, they fought, they bled, and every night they came back down fewer than before. Each assault felt like hitting a wall made of fire and steel. The plan was the same as always. Attack from the east, move in squads, clear each bunker, hold ground until dark. It sounded simple when officers said it on the radio. On the ground, it was chaos. At first light, the battalion moved out. The jungle steamed from the night's rain. Mud sucked at their boots, pulling them down with every step. The smell was unbearable, a mix of smoke, rot, and something worse, something human. Halfway up the slope, the first shots came. Short bursts of automatic fire from somewhere above. The soldiers dropped to their stomachs, pressing themselves into the mud as bullets snapped over their heads. Mortars began to fall almost immediately, shaking the earth and filling the air with black smoke. The North Vietnamese were dug in deep. Their bunkers were built from thick logs stacked 3 layers high, covered with mud so heavy that bombs barely scratched them. Every time the Americans took one out, they discovered another hidden farther up the hill. The fight was endless. One soldier later said it felt like the ground itself was trying to kill them. Men crawled forward, firing into the jungle, throwing grenades into the smoke. The explosions lit up the trees, sending leaves and branches flying. Every few minutes came another cry for a medic. Every few minutes, another voice went silent. By midday, the entire slope was alive with fire. The rain turned red as it mixed with mud and blood. Helicopters circled above, trying to drop supplies, but the gunfire was too thick. They couldn't land. One pilot tried anyway and was hit before he even touched the ground. His helicopter spun once, then vanished into the trees. Still, the order came again. Keep moving. The men advanced through smoke so thick they could barely see their own hands. Napalm burned in puddles along the slope. The heat rolled off the ground like an oven. Trees smouldered. The jungle was dying, but it didn't matter. The enemy was still firing. Somewhere near the top of the hill, the lead platoon ran into a maze of trenches. It was a fortress hidden under the dirt, with tunnels connecting bunkers to bunkers, firing holes aimed at every approach. The men moved through it in silence, clearing it room by room. Grenades went off inside the tunnels, the sound trapped, deafening. The smell of gunpowder and death filled the air. By the time they broke through to the far side, only half the platoon was left standing. They pulled back as darkness fell. Rain poured harder, soaking everything. The men collapsed into the mud, shaking from exhaustion. Some fell asleep where they sat, rifles still in their hands. No one talked much anymore. The chatter that used to fill the camp at night, the jokes, the stories, the songs, had vanished. Now there was only silence. The only sound was the rain hitting helmets and the distant thud of artillery echoing through the valley. From his command post, Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt looked up at the hill through binoculars. It was nothing but smoke and fire. His face was hard, unreadable. He believed in persistence, in breaking the enemy through sheer force of will. But even he could see it. The hill wasn't breaking. By the 7th day, the men began to think it never would. They climbed again the next morning, through mud that reached their knees. The jungle had been bombed so many times that the ground looked like the surface of another planet. Still, the North Vietnamese fought on, their machine guns firing until the barrels glowed red. When darkness fell again, the mountain burned under the rain, orange flames fighting grey clouds. The valley echoed with the sound of distant cries and falling trees. The men called it the hill that would not die. And as they lay in the mud that night, shivering under ponchos, one thought spread quietly through the ranks. If the enemy doesn't kill us, the hill will. The 8th day began with the sound the men had learned to fear. The slow, growing roar of jet engines rolling through the clouds. The air shuddered, the ground trembled, then the sky split open. From above, the first wave of F-4 Phantoms dove through the clouds, silver streaks against a grey sky. Behind them came A1 Sky Raiders, their wings heavy with bombs. The soldiers below looked up through the rain and smoke, watching as hundreds of gallons of fire fell from the heavens. Napalm. The canisters tumbled end over end, trailing white smoke, before bursting open in orange fireballs that rolled across the hillside. The jungle vanished under waves of flame. The heat was instant and violent, sweeping down the slopes like the breath of a furnace. Trees exploded, leaves turned to ash. The air itself caught fire. From the base of the hill, the men could feel it, a blast of heat that hit their faces even from hundreds of yards away. Some turned their heads, others couldn't look away. The entire mountain was burning. The hill screamed. The sound wasn't human, it was the sound of the fire devouring everything, the crack of trees splitting open, the hiss of boiling mud, the roar of detonating ammunition buried in the ground. The flames rolled downward, feeding on bamboo and grass, turning the jungle into one endless torch. When the airstrikes ended, silence fell. The men waited for the smoke to clear, watching the hill glow like molten rock. Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt gave the order to move. The soldiers began to climb, their boots sinking into mud that steamed from the heat. The ground was black and slick. The smell was unbearable, a mix of gasoline, charred leaves, and something that wasn't just the jungle. They advanced slowly, rifles at the ready, eyes searching the smoke for movement. For a moment it seemed over. Nothing could have lived through that fire. Then came the gunfire. Short bursts, precise, controlled. The North Vietnamese were still there. They had been underground the entire time, shielded by tunnels and bunkers carved deep into the hillside. When the flames passed, they came crawling back up, blackened, filthy, alive, and still fighting. The soldiers dropped flat as bullets cut through the smoke. The air filled again with the crack of rifles and the deeper thump of machine guns. The fire had cleared the jungle, but it had also stripped away every bit of cover. Now the Americans were completely exposed. They moved from crater to crater, firing up the slope. The heat from the napalm was still rising from the ground, burning their hands when they touched it. Ammunition popped in the wreckage. The mud clung to everything: rifles, skin, uniforms. Helicopters tried to drop more supplies, but even they had to stay high. The air shimmered from the heat. The smell of chemicals burned in their lungs. A squad made it halfway up before another explosion sent them tumbling backward. The enemy was using mortars now, dropping shells blindly into the smoke. Each impact sent showers of dirt and ash into the air. By midday, the entire slope was covered in steam. The fire had burned away the leaves, the vines, even the colour of the soil. Everything was shades of black, grey and red. The hill looked like something out of another world, a place where nothing human should exist. And yet it was alive with battle. One soldier slipped in the mud, falling face first into a puddle, still boiling from the napalm. Another pulled him out with bare hands, both of them screaming. A medic crawled through open fire to reach a man hit in the leg, only to be struck himself. Helicopters hovered low, trying to evacuate the wounded, their rotors kicking up ash and rain. From the command post below, Honeycutt could see almost nothing through the smoke. He spoke into his radio calmly, his voice cutting through static and chaos. "Keep moving," he said. "The hill isn't done yet." By late afternoon, the rain began again. It hissed against the hot earth, turning fire into clouds of white steam. The soldiers pulled back to the lower slopes, dragging the wounded through the mud. The air cooled, but the smell of burning lingered. The mountain still glowed faintly in the dark, like an ember refusing to die. That night, the valley looked like hell itself. Smoke drifting through the trees, rain falling on fire, the glow of distant explosions lighting the clouds. The men sat in silence, staring up at the hill that had swallowed so many of their friends. They had bombed it, burned it, and buried it under fire. But Hill 937 was still there, and in the morning they would climb it again. By the 9th day the sky gave up, pretending to be merciful. The monsoon came roaring in from the west, thick, grey, endless. Rain slammed against the burned slopes of Hill 937, turning every crater into a pit of brown water and every trail into a river of mud. The jungle, what was left of it, steamed beneath the downpour like a living thing trying to breathe again. For the soldiers on the ground it was a curse. They were soaked to the bone before the sun even rose. Water poured from their helmets, their boots squelched with every step, and the hill, that cursed, smoking hill, had become nothing more than a wall of mud and misery. The 101st Airborne Division had been fighting here for more than a week. They had bombed the mountain until it glowed, burned the jungle until it vanished, and still the enemy clung to it like roots in stone. The soldiers had stopped asking why. They only knew the order had come again. Climb it. The rain made every movement torture. Rifles jammed, radios shorted, maps turned to pulp in their hands. The ground gave way beneath them, sliding underfoot as they tried to crawl uphill. The smell of rot and gunpowder filled the air, heavy and sour. They moved in silence, hunched over, squinting through the rain. The visibility was almost zero. The fog clung to everything. Somewhere above, the North Vietnamese waited. The soldiers couldn't see them, but they could feel them. Eyes in the mist, fingers on triggers. The first shots came without warning. Short bursts, echoing down the slope. Machine gun fire cut through the rain like chainsaws. The men dropped instantly, vanishing into the mud. Bullets snapped through the trees, tearing bark, slicing leaves. Mortar shells followed, their explosions muffled by the rain but no less deadly. "Get down!" someone shouted, though no one needed to be told. The air filled with dirt and water. The men crawled forward, firing blindly into the fog. Every direction looked the same, grey, wet, empty. The enemy seemed to appear and disappear like shadows. 1 second there was silence, the next, chaos. A medic crawled through the mud toward a wounded soldier, his hands slipping on blood-slick ground. He was halfway there when another explosion hit. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of him but his helmet. Helicopters circled above the valley, their blades chopping through the rain, trying to find landing zones to pull the wounded out. But the weather was too heavy, the gunfire too thick. The pilots hovered as long as they dared, then pulled away, leaving men waving desperately from the trees below. By midday, the hill was a battlefield of mud and water. The soldiers climbed on their hands and knees, their fingers digging into the earth to keep from sliding backward. Their rifles were coated in filth. Their grenades slipped from muddy hands. The enemy fired down from invisible bunkers, hidden behind sheets of rain and fog. Every step cost something. Every yard forward was paid for in blood. When the afternoon came, lightning flashed across the valley. Thunder rolled through the clouds. For a moment, the entire battlefield lit up in ghostly white. The burned trees, the torn earth, the bodies half buried in the mud. Then the light vanished, and the rain came even harder. The fighting never stopped. By late evening, the soldiers were digging in again, forming shallow holes that filled instantly with water. They were too tired to eat, too wet to sleep. They sat in the mud with their rifles across their knees, staring into the darkness, waiting for the next order, the next attack, the next sound that meant someone else was dying. The hill above them glowed faintly through the fog, the reflection of flares and tracer-rounds dancing across the smoke. The rain fell harder still, washing the blood into the soil, carrying it downhill in thin red streams. In the command post below, Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt listened to the reports coming over the radio. Units down to half strength. Whole platoons missing, men too exhausted to move. The numbers didn't seem real anymore. He looked out at the rain, at the shape of the mountain in the distance, and said the same words he had said every night since the battle began. "We go again tomorrow." Back on the hill, the men sat in silence. No one spoke. They didn't have to. They all knew what tomorrow meant. Another climb. Another day of rain, fire, and death. And still, none of them turned back, because somewhere up there, above the clouds and the gunfire, was an order that wouldn't die. Take the hill. And so, as night swallowed the valley and rain washed over the dead, the living prepared to climb again. By the 10th day, the men of the 101st Airborne Division were no longer fighting for a hill. They were fighting for each other. The monsoon had eased just enough for the air to turn hot again. The valley steamed, the ground sizzled with leftover napalm, and the air hung heavy with the smell of sulphur and decay. The jungle that once cloaked Hill 937 was gone, replaced by a wasteland of black stumps, mud, and smoke. The only green left was the moss clinging to dead trees and the mould growing on wet gear. At dawn, the battalion moved out again. No speeches, no orders shouted. Just movement. Slow, quiet, automatic. Every man knew what came next. The rain had carved deep grooves into the slope, and the soldiers climbed through them one by one, using their rifles for balance, slipping and stumbling in the muck. The mud was so deep it swallowed boots whole. Leeches clung to their legs. The weight of their packs bent them low to the ground. Halfway up, the silence broke. Machine guns opened from the ridgeline. Mortars whistled through the air. The ground erupted. Dirt and fire filled the sky. The men dove into the mud, pressing their faces into the cold earth as shrapnel tore through the trees above them. The enemy was still there, unseen, unbroken, unrelenting. Their bunkers had survived 9 days of bombing. They had survived napalm, artillery, rain, and starvation. Now, on the 10th day, they fought like ghosts defending the gates of hell. The soldiers returned fire. They moved in short bursts, 5 yards forward, drop, fire, reload. Grenades rolled through the mud, detonating with dull thuds that sent showers of soil and broken wood flying. The air was thick with gunsmoke and rain. A medic crawled past, dragging a wounded man by his collar. Blood mixed with water. Another soldier, hit in the leg, kept firing until his rifle jammed, then threw rocks out of sheer rage. The sound of explosions drowned out everything: words, orders, thoughts. Above the chaos, helicopters appeared. Hueys and Cobras darted through the haze, flying low, their rotors chopping the smoke into clouds. Door gunners leaned out, firing bursts from M60s that glowed red hot. One Huey dropped straight into the storm, its skids barely clearing the treetops as it lowered ropes for the wounded. The pilot stayed in position under a rain of bullets, hovering over the flames. His co-pilot shouted through the intercom that they were taking hits. The pilot didn't move. "We hold," he said. "They're not dying down there." The helicopter rose only when the last man was lifted aboard. It had holes punched through both sides of the fuselage, its windshield cracked, its engine bleeding smoke. It made it barely half a mile before crash landing in a rice paddy. Everyone inside lived. Back on the hill, the men fought hand to hand. The slope was too steep for formations, too close for distance. Rifles became clubs, shovels became weapons. One platoon cleared a line of bunkers, lost half their men doing it, then held the ground until dark. When the firing finally stopped, the world was still shaking. The hill burned again. Not from airstrikes this time, but from the heat of the fight itself. The smoke hung low, lit by glowing embers that drifted through the night like fireflies. The soldiers sat in the mud, their faces lit by faint orange light. Some cleaned their weapons, some didn't bother. A few just stared into the fire, eyes empty. One man, a private from Tennessee, took off his helmet and laughed, quietly at first, then louder. No one stopped him. After 10 days of death and fire, laughter was all that was left to prove he was still alive. When he stopped, the silence returned. They were running out of ammunition, they were running out of men, but they weren't running out of courage. All across the line, small acts of bravery kept happening. A sergeant giving his last magazine to a new recruit, a medic refusing evacuation to stay with the dying, a radio operator using his own body to shield a wounded friend from shrapnel. The hill didn't care who was brave, it just kept taking. By nightfall the rain began again, light, steady, almost peaceful. The smoke turned to mist, the flames to glowing coals. The valley glowed dimly beneath the clouds, a broken world lit by war. In the distance the sound of engines rumbled, tanks and helicopters moving into position for what everyone knew was coming next. The final assault. The men lay in the mud, trying to rest, trying not to think. Tomorrow they would climb again. Tomorrow it would end, one way or another. The jungle was gone, the sky was fire, and all that remained were brothers, shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the dawn. Dawn came like the opening of a furnace. The air was already hot, the sky heavy and red, and the mountain loomed over the valley like something alive. 10 days of blood, fire and rain had stripped it bare. No trees, no grass, just black soil and smoke. The men at the base of Hill 937 stared up at it in silence. No one said a word. No one needed to. This was the day. The order had come down at first light. Take the hill. The final assault would throw everything the US Army had left at one mountain. Artillery batteries in the valley began firing before sunrise, hundreds of shells slamming into the ridge. The explosions rolled like thunder across the clouds. Then came the airstrikes. Jets screamed overhead. F-4 Phantoms, A-1 Sky Raiders, Cobra gunships, dropping napalm, bombs and rockets into the smoking jungle. The whole mountain disappeared behind a curtain of flame and dust. The ground trembled beneath the soldiers' boots. The shockwaves knocked leaves off trees miles away. When the bombardment ended, a strange stillness settled over the valley. The air shimmered with heat. Smoke curled from the slopes. Somewhere above, the North Vietnamese were still there, buried deep in their tunnels, waiting. Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt's voice came over the radio, steady and cold. "All units, move." The men began to climb. They went in 3 lines up the slope, rifles raised, boots sinking in the black mud. The air burned in their lungs, thick with smoke and gunpowder. Every inch upward felt like dragging through quicksand. The only sounds were the rasp of breath and the soft click of gear. Then came the first gunfire. Short, sharp bursts from the ridge above. Tracer rounds streaked down through the smoke. The men dropped to the ground, returning fire, crawling forward inch by inch. Grenades rolled downhill, exploding in the mud, showering them with dirt and debris. A platoon on the left flank got pinned behind a line of burned logs. The enemy had perfect angles from the bunkers above. For every shot fired up, 5 came down. The men hugged the ground, waiting for air support that wasn't coming. The sky was too crowded with smoke. Still, they moved. One squad broke through a cluster of bunkers halfway up the slope. The tunnels were deep, black holes in the mud, filled with the smell of earth and gunpowder. They cleared them with grenades, one by one. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the dirt under their hands. By late morning, the entire hill was alive again. Gunfire, smoke, shouting, the steady rhythm of explosions. The men climbed in bursts, covering each other, slipping, sliding, rising again. Every yard gained was paid for with blood. Some soldiers carried the wounded on their backs. Others fought until their rifles were empty, then used their bayonets. One sergeant was hit 3 times and kept moving until he reached the ridge, where he finally collapsed, smiling as he went down. By noon, the top was close. The last stretch of the hill was steep, nearly vertical, the mud slick from rain and blood. The men used tree roots and burned branches to pull themselves up. Machine guns rattled above them, cutting down whole lines of soldiers. The survivors kept going, their hands bleeding, their faces streaked with ash. When they reached the crest, they found the enemy waiting. The North Vietnamese had built their last bunkers just below the summit, dug deep into the earth. The fight was face to face. Rifles, grenades, fists. The air filled with the sound of men screaming, the dull thud of impacts, the crash of grenades exploding inside tunnels. It lasted less than an hour. When it was over, the gunfire stopped all at once. The smoke began to clear. The jungle was gone. The hill was dead. And the Americans were standing on the top. For a long moment, no one spoke. The men just stared at the blackened earth around them, the wreckage, the shell holes, the twisted bodies. They had taken the hill, but there was nothing left to take. A few soldiers raised their rifles weakly into the air. Others sat down where they stood, too tired to move. One man pulled a small American flag from his pack, tattered and wet, and planted it in the mud. It barely stood upright in the wind. The mountain that had burned, screamed and bled for 10 days was finally quiet. Honeycutt climbed to the top soon after. His uniform was soaked with sweat and rain, his face streaked with mud. He looked out over the valley, a wasteland of smoke and craters, and nodded once. It was done. The radio reports went out that afternoon. Hill 937 secured. Enemy resistance broken. But for the men who had fought there was no victory, just silence, exhaustion, and the question that none of them dared to ask out loud. Was it worth it? The answer would come weeks later, when the order arrived to abandon the hill they had given everything to take. For now, they stood in the mud at the top of the mountain, staring at the world they had destroyed. The hill was theirs, but the cost was too high for anyone to celebrate. The battle was over, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the war itself. Rain drifted across the valley in thin grey sheets, falling softly over the blackened slopes of Hill 937. Smoke still rose from the craters where bombs had hit, curling into the clouds like ghosts escaping the earth. The jungle was gone. Nothing lived there now but flies and memory. For the men of the 101st Airborne, the end came not with victory parades or speeches, but with an order. It arrived quietly, transmitted through static from command. Evacuate the hill. Withdraw to base. Do not reoccupy. After 10 days of blood, mud and fire, after hundreds of lives lost for a single patch of ground, they were leaving it behind. The soldiers stared at one another in disbelief. They had fought, bled and burned for that mountain, climbed it again and again until the jungle itself had caught fire. And now they were being told it didn't matter. The hill they had turned into hell was being abandoned. At dawn, helicopters returned to the summit for the last time. Their rotors stirred the ash into small storms that whipped across the cratered soil. The men loaded what was left of their gear, empty ammo cans, broken stretchers, rusted helmets. They moved slowly, mechanically, like men trying to wake from a nightmare that refused to end. When the last aircraft lifted off, the wind from its blades blew across the summit, scattering dust over the trenches where their friends had fallen. Within minutes, the jungle began to reclaim it. The first vines were already creeping up through the cracks of burned earth. From the air, the hill looked like a scar, black against the endless green of the valley. It was over. The mountain that had devoured 10 days of war was now just another piece of land the maps no longer cared about. But back home, the story was only beginning. News of the battle broke across American newspapers in late May. Headlines spoke of the bloodiest fight of the year. The photographs showed soldiers covered in mud, eyes hollow, faces blank. Reporters called it a victory, then questioned why anyone had fought for it. Within days, television anchors were asking the same question the soldiers had whispered in the mud. Why? The footage of helicopters lifting off from the burned summit played on evening news across the country. Commentators spoke in quiet, careful tones. Senators demanded explanations. The public, already weary from years of war, erupted in anger. In coffee shops and living rooms, people stared at the images of a hill that looked like another planet. They heard the casualty counts. They read about the withdrawal. And for the first time, many began to believe that victory in Vietnam might not mean anything at all. The phrase Hamburger Hill caught like wildfire. It was a soldier's term, grim and simple, a hill that chewed up men and spit them out. The press made it famous. Overnight, it became a symbol for everything wrong with the war. The futility, the confusion, the endless sacrifice for ground that would never be held. Letters flooded Washington. Parents of soldiers demanded answers. Veterans wrote furious editorials. Even some generals in private admitted that the optics were catastrophic. The Pentagon tried to explain it as a tactical success, proof that American firepower could take any objective. But no one was listening. The photographs told a different story. The faces of the soldiers told the truth. The outrage grew louder. Members of Congress called for hearings. One headline read simply, 10 days of hell for nothing. The soldiers who had survived didn't need newspapers to tell them what it meant. They already knew. They had watched the hill burn. They had buried their friends in its soil. They had walked away from it, knowing the rain would wash away everything. The trenches, the craters, the flag they had planted at the top. For them, the war didn't end on that mountain. It stayed in their minds, in the smell of smoke, in the sound of helicopters thumping through the clouds, in the faces of the ones who never made it down. In the A Shau Valley, the jungle began to grow again. Grass sprouted through the ash. Birds returned. The earth began to hide its scars. But for those who had climbed it, Hill 937 would never fade. It would remain forever in their dreams, a mountain made of mud, fire and loss. And back home, the people who saw the photographs would never forget it either. The battle for Hamburger Hill was over, but the battle to explain it had just begun. In the months that followed, the echoes of Hill 937 reached farther than the A Shau Valley. The jungle was silent now, but the storm it unleashed roared through Washington, through every newsroom, and through the conscience of a country already breaking under the weight of a war it could no longer understand. The questions came first, sharp, relentless, unending. Why had so many died for ground that was never held? Why had commanders sent men up the same burning hill again and again? Was it strategy or stubbornness? At the centre of that storm stood Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, the man who had ordered the assaults, the man the press called hardcore. Reporters hunted him for answers. Some called him a hero, others called him a butcher. But Honeycutt didn't hide. He faced the cameras with the same cold, unshakable composure he had shown under fire. His uniform pressed, his jaw locked tight, his voice even. He said he had done what every officer is trained to do: take the objective, complete the mission, and bring as many men home as possible. He reminded everyone that the hill had been a key enemy stronghold, part of a supply route stretching to Laos. He said the enemy had to be broken there, or they would keep using the valley to move weapons south. Then he paused. He admitted that the cost had been severe. Behind that word hid everything: the burned jungle, the charred bodies, the screams that still echoed through the night. The cost was hundreds of young soldiers who never saw another sunrise. The cost was the smell of napalm that stayed in their clothes for weeks. The cost was the silence of the survivors who couldn't explain what they'd seen. In interviews, soldiers were asked what it was like. Most didn't answer. The ones who did use short, broken phrases: mud up to your knees, rain that never stopped, bodies on fire. One man said the hill smelled like a burned world. Another said he still woke up hearing the sound of airstrikes, even years later. They weren't political. They didn't argue about strategy or policy. They just remembered what it felt like to be there. The heat of the napalm, the sight of a friend's hand reaching out from the mud, the endless climb that led nowhere. Journalists turned those memories into headlines. The hill that ate men. The battle that should never have happened. A victory that felt like defeat. For the military, the fallout was immediate. Generals faced hearings. Senators demanded reform. Even within the army, officers began questioning the obsession with body counts and terrain that held no long-term value. Behind closed doors, whispers turned into directives. No more Hamburger Hills, one Pentagon official said, and the phrase stuck. It became policy. No more battles of attrition for meaningless ground. No more mountains of fire. No more rivers of blood flowing down hills no one would hold. The war itself didn't end, but something inside it broke. The commanders learned caution. The soldiers learned distrust. And the American people, already disillusioned by years of fighting, turned their anger into protest. Hamburger Hill had changed everything. For Honeycutt, the weight never lifted. He continued to serve, but the questions followed him everywhere. In private, some said he carried the hill with him for the rest of his life. He was a soldier, disciplined, decisive, but even he couldn't escape the ghosts of that mountain. In later interviews, his voice grew softer. He spoke less about victory, more about the men. He said they were the best he had ever commanded. He said they did everything asked of them, and more. He never apologised for the battle. He didn't have to. The men who fought there didn't hate him. They understood him. They had seen him in the mud with them, shouting orders through the smoke, risking his life for theirs. The war demanded impossible choices. He made them. The soldiers paid the price. And when it was over, both sides, commander and commanded, were left with the same invisible scar. In the A Shau Valley, rain fell again, steady and cold. The jungle crept back across the scarred slopes. The trees grew over the craters. The hill was quiet now, but the earth still carried the smell of burnt soil when it rained. For those who survived, the weight of command wasn't just carried by officers. It was shared by everyone who climbed that mountain, every private, every medic, every pilot who flew through the smoke. Because in war, orders may come from above, but the burden always settles on those below. And on Hill 937, that burden would last a lifetime. Time moved on, but the hill never really disappeared. It stayed there in the heart of the A Shau Valley, covered again by vines and silence. The jungle regrew, but beneath the green canopy lay a graveyard of burned trees, rusted rifles, and memories that refused to die. For the soldiers who fought there, the hill became something more than a battlefield. It became a symbol of everything they had endured and everything they had lost. In the years that followed, politicians would call it a mistake. Generals would call it a lesson. The men who climbed it simply called it the hill. No one needed to explain which one. When the news first reached America that the hill had been abandoned, outrage swept across the country. Parents of fallen soldiers demanded answers. Veterans wrote to newspapers asking what victory could possibly mean if the hill they had taken was already lost. Protests against the war intensified. The image of that smoking mountain, blackened, lifeless, soaked in rain, became a kind of mirror for the entire conflict. It was courage without purpose, sacrifice without reward. In the halls of power, those images carried weight. Military leaders began rewriting their rules of engagement. No more Hamburger Hills became an unwritten commandment, a phrase passed from one briefing room to another. Never again would American forces spend so many lives for ground that held no strategic worth. The shift changed the course of the war itself. US strategy moved away from seizing terrain toward withdrawing troops, turning more responsibility over to South Vietnamese forces. The change had already been brewing, but Hamburger Hill pushed it into motion. For historians, the battle became a case study in how wars unravel, not from defeat in combat, but from exhaustion, confusion, and loss of faith. The US had won on the field, yet it felt like a defeat everywhere else. For the survivors, the legacy was something quieter, heavier. They carried it home in their bodies and in their minds. Some couldn't stand the smell of rain for years afterward. It reminded them of smoke and napalm. Others would wake up in the night, hearing the rotor blades of Hueys or the screams that never really faded. One veteran, years later, said the hill taught him the meaning of endurance. Another said it taught him the meaning of futility. Both were right. The jungle eventually swallowed the battlefield. The earth grew over the craters, covering the scars with moss and roots. Birds returned, and the valley looked alive again. But the soil still carried traces of the fire, and pieces of metal that would never rust away. Tourists visit now, climbing the hill that once burned for 10 straight days. Some of them know what happened there. Most do not. They take photographs of the view, not realising they're standing on ground that drank the blood of hundreds. The locals call it by its old number, Hill 937, but the veterans still call it by the name it earned in war, Hamburger Hill. To them it isn't just a place, it's a memory, a warning, a question with no easy answer. The battle showed what courage looks like when it has nowhere to go. It showed what loyalty means when everything around you burns. It showed the cost of obedience and the price of command. And it changed the way America thought about war forever. When commanders said no more Hamburger Hills, they weren't talking about strategy, they were talking about conscience, because some battles should never be fought again. The men who climbed that hill carried its legacy into old age. Some spoke of it quietly to their families, others never mentioned it at all. But all of them knew the truth that only those who had been there could understand. The jungle didn't catch fire because of napalm alone. It caught fire because of what war does to men. And when it was over, there was nothing left to burn. The Battle of Hamburger Hill stands today as one of the most brutal, senseless, and unforgettable moments of the Vietnam War. Not because of strategy, not because of victory, but because of what it revealed. That courage and tragedy can live in the same story, that fire can purify and destroy, and that sometimes survival itself is the only triumph left. The rain still falls on Hill 937, the jungle hums again, but somewhere in that valley, under the roots and vines, the soil still remembers, and every time the wind moves through the trees, it whispers the names of those who never came back down. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.